It was a hondax, meticulously carved from a rare, shimmering piece of red quartzite, a stone that would have been difficult to find and even harder to shape. Archaeologists who found it deep in the Cima de los Huesos, a limestone cavern in northern Spain, were baffled. This wasn't just a piece of trash. In a world where a sharp edge was the literal difference between life and death, this was the equivalent of throwing a pristine, gold-plated surgical kit into a trash heap. But it wasn't trash. It was a clue. This discovery is the opening file in one of the greatest cold cases in human history, the mystery of why our ancestors began believing in things they could not see. For millions of years, our predecessors lived like every other animal, focused entirely on the immediate, the physical, and the edible. Then, something in the wiring of the human brain short-circuited. We stopped looking at the world as a collection of objects and started seeing it as a stage for hidden intentions. We didn't just invent gods, we became obsessed with them. We spent our limited resources building them houses, we sacrificed our food for them, and we even died for them. If this was an evolutionary mistake, it was the most successful mistake in the history of life. But if that red hondax was meant for a spirit, it suggests that the concept of the supernatural is far older than civilization itself. It implies that before we had wheels, before we had wheat, and before we had words for God, we were already acting as if someone was watching. To solve this mystery, we have to look past the myths and investigate the evidence like a forensic team at a crime scene. We have to figure out if religion was a biological accident, a clever social survival tool, or a psychological bridge that allowed us to cross the threshold from being clever apes to becoming the masters of the planet. If the evidence from that Spanish pit seems like a fluke, we have to confront the fact that it's actually part of a global pattern. For a long time, researchers assumed that early humans were too primitive for complex spiritual thoughts. They figured that ancient burials were just a way to keep predators away from a camp. But that theory falls apart under the weight of the actual evidence. When we look at sites like Shanidar Cave in the Zagros Mountains of Iraq, we see something that hygiene can't explain. In the 1950s, archaeologist Ralph Seletsky discovered the remains of several Neanderthals. One of them, known as Shanidar 4, was found resting in a flexed position, surrounded by soil that contained high concentrations of pollen from yarrow, cornflower, and mallow. These weren't just weeds. They were wild flowers with known medicinal properties. Hygiene doesn't require flowers. It doesn't require arranging a body in a sleeping position. The hygiene hypothesis is a dead end because it fails to account for the sheer cost of these actions. In the brutal environment of the Pleistocene, every calorie mattered. Spending hours digging a grave and gathering specific blossoms for a dead person is, from a purely biological standpoint, a waste of energy. Unless, of course, you believe that the person isn't actually gone. The flowers weren't for the dead body, they were for the mind that the survivors believed still existed in another realm. This suggests that the detective in the human brain had already begun to suspect that the physical world wasn't the whole story. However, just because we find flowers in a cave doesn't mean the case for the divine is settled. Actually, the deeper we look into these early rituals, the more it seems like we might be misreading the motive entirely. Maybe these rituals weren't about the dead at all, but about the living. To find the real fingerprints of the first gods, we have to look at the cognitive hardware of the human brain itself. Scientists have identified a specific mechanism called the hyperactive agency detection device, or HADD. It's an evolutionary survival trait that makes us assume every noise in the dark is caused by a conscious being. Imagine you're a hunter-gatherer on the African savanna 100,000 years ago. You hear a rustle in the tall grass. You have two choices. You can assume it's just the wind, or you can assume it's a leopard. If you assume it's the wind and it's actually a leopard, you're dead. You're removed from the gene pool. But if you assume it's a leopard and it's actually just the wind, you've lost nothing but a few seconds of heart palpitations. Evolution, therefore, selected for the paranoid brain. It hardwired us to overdetect agency. We are the descendants of the people who saw ghosts in the shadows, because the people who only saw shadows didn't live long enough to become our ancestors. This agency detection glitch is the first real clue in our investigation. It explains why we see faces in the clouds or why we get angry at our computers when they crash. We are biologically incapable of seeing the world as truly random. But if this was just a simple survival reflex, it shouldn't have led to organized religion. A leopard in the grass is a physical threat, but a god in the sky is an abstract concept. So, how did a survival reflex turn into a spiritual revolution? The answer might lie in another piece of mental equipment, the theory of mind. This is the ability to understand that other people have their own thoughts, desires, and intentions. It's what allows us to lie, to empathize, and to predict what a rival might do next. But researchers like Jesse Bering have shown that we struggle to turn this system off, even when it's not applicable. In one of his most famous experiments, Bering used a princess puppet named Alice to interact with children. He told the children that Princess Alice was invisible, but she would give them signs if they chose the wrong box in a game. Even though the signs were just random events, a picture falling off a wall or a light flickering, the children immediately interpreted them as intentional messages from the invisible princess. We are born with a cognitive misfire that expects invisible agents to communicate with us. We don't just see the leopard in the grass. We assume the leopard is there because it's angry at us. We assume the storm is happening because we did something wrong. This is where the first gods likely came from. They weren't complex theological figures. They were just the invisible others who were responsible for the things we couldn't explain. We started talking to the sky because our brains are literally incapable of believing that the sky isn't listening. If the brain is just a machine for making mistakes, though, we have to ask why those mistakes were never corrected by natural selection. Usually, when a species spends its time and energy on a hallucination, it gets outcompeted by species that focus on reality. But in the case of humans, the hallucinations seem to make us stronger. This brings us to a major turning point in our investigation, the social glue theory. As human groups grew larger, we ran into a massive problem that scientists call the free rider problem. In a small band of 20 people, everyone knows if you're a thief or a liar. But once a group hits about 150 members, a limit known as Dunbar's number, it becomes impossible to keep track of everyone's reputation. People can start cheating, stealing meat, or avoiding work without being caught. This social friction should have caused human groups to shatter and collapse back into tiny family units. But they didn't. They grew into cities of thousands. The only reason this was possible is because we invented a super cop who could see in the dark. If you believe that a powerful, invisible spirit is watching your every move and has the power to punish you with a lightning strike or a plague, you're much less likely to steal from your neighbor. It doesn't matter if the spirit is real. The belief in the spirit is real enough to change your behavior. Psychologist Ara Norenzayan has argued that big gods who are concerned with human morality, were the essential technology that allowed us to build civilization. They were the ultimate surveillance system. If this sounds like a nice theory with no physical evidence, consider the research of Richard Sosis. He studied 19th-century communes in the United States to see which ones lasted the longest. He found that secular communes, based on shared political or social ideals, lasted an average of only 6 years. But religious communes, especially those that required costly signals, like difficult rituals, dietary restrictions, or painful ceremonies, lasted much longer. The more a religion cost its members, the more it proved their commitment to the group. The gods weren't just a mistake, they were a filter. They filtered out the people who weren't willing to cooperate. But wait, if religion was just a tool to keep large groups of people in line, then it should have appeared after we started living in large groups. For 100 years, that was the standard verdict in archaeology. First, we invented farming. Then we lived in big villages. Then we needed a way to control people, so we invented organized religion. It was a neat, logical progression. But in 1994, a discovery in southeastern Turkey completely blew that case wide open and forced every historian to rethink the timeline of human history. The site is called Göbekli Tepe, and it is a nightmare for the traditional agriculture-first theory. It consists of massive, T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons, arranged in perfect circles. These pillars are decorated with intricate carvings of scorpions, lions, and vultures. They were built 11,500 years ago, which makes them twice as old as the pyramids of Giza. But here's the kicker: the people who built them weren't farmers. There are no houses at Göbekli Tepe. There are no trash pits filled with domestic waste. There are no signs of domesticated grain. The people who carved these massive stones were nomadic hunter-gatherers who lived in small bands. According to every textbook written before 1994, these people shouldn't have been able to build this. You need a massive, organized workforce to move a 20-ton stone without wheels or beasts of burden. You need to feed those people. And you need a reason to do it. The evidence at Göbekli Tepe suggests that it was the desire to build a temple that forced humans to invent farming, not the other way around. Klaus Schmidt, the archaeologist who led the excavation, famously proposed that the temple came before the city. He argued that nomadic tribes from all over the region gathered at this holy site for rituals. To feed the hundreds of workers required for such a project, they couldn't rely on wild gazelles and berries. They had to find a more reliable way to produce food. It's no coincidence that the world's first domesticated wheat has been genetically traced back to a mountain just 30 kilometers away from Göbekli Tepe. We didn't become farmers because we were hungry. We became farmers because we wanted to stay close to our gods. If the birth of civilization was driven by a religious impulse, we have to ask where that impulse was hiding for the previous 300,000 years. Actually, the evidence suggests it wasn't hiding at all. It was just operating on a smaller, more intimate scale. We see it in the costly signaling of ancient jewelry made from rare shells transported hundreds of miles. We see it in the Bruniquel cave in France, where Neanderthals, yes, Neanderthals, ventured 300 meters deep into the pitch-black earth to build strange, circular structures out of broken stalagmites. They weren't living there. They were using fire and stone to mark a space as other. This ritual behavior appears to be a biological imperative. It's a way for the human brain to manage the overwhelming stress of being alive. Evolutionarily speaking, humans are the only animals that are fully aware of their own mortality. We are the only creatures who know for a fact that we are going to die. That kind of knowledge is psychologically paralyzing. It triggers a constant flow of cortisol, the stress hormone, which can suppress the immune system and damage the heart. Religion acts as a biological safety valve. When people participate in collective rituals, whether it's chanting, dancing, or prayer, their brains release a flood of endorphins and oxytocin. These chemicals don't just make us feel good, they literally lower our stress levels and bond us to the people around us. In a study of Israeli kibbutzim, researchers found that the more religious members had lower blood pressure and better long-term health outcomes than the secular members. The mistake of believing in the supernatural might have actually been a biological life raft that kept our ancestors from sinking into despair. But if religion is just a biological stress reliever or a social police force, why does it feel so personal? Why does it feel like a deep, fundamental truth to the billions of people who still practice it? This is where the investigation takes a turn into the modern day. We might live in a world of silicon chips and space telescopes, but our brains are still running the Pleistocene software. We are still the descendants of the people who saw the leopard in the grass. In the 21st century, we still have our own costly rituals. We wear specific jerseys to help our sports teams win. We knock on wood to avoid jinxing ourselves. We feel a strange sense of comfort when we repeat a certain phrase or perform a certain action. These are the modern versions of the red Hondax thrown into the pit. They are attempts to negotiate with a universe that we still, deep down, believe is sentient. Even the most hardened atheists often find themselves feeling grateful for good luck, but they can't quite explain who they are thanking. That feeling is the ghost of 100,000 generations of ancestors who knew exactly who they were thanking. If the evidence shows that we are hardwired for the divine, it means that the mystery of why we started believing in gods is actually a mystery of why we think we could ever stop. We didn't start believing in gods because we were stupid or because we didn't understand science. We started believing in them because they were the only thing that could hold us together. They were the bridge between the animal and the human. Without the mistake of the supernatural, we would still be small bands of primates wandering the savanna, terrified of the leopard in the grass. Instead, we used that fear to build cathedrals. However, the most chilling part of this investigation isn't that we invented the gods. It's that the gods might have invented us. Not in a literal sense, but in a developmental one. The pressure to please an invisible watcher forced us to become more cooperative, more disciplined, and more imaginative. It pushed our cognitive abilities to the limit, forcing us to think about the future, the past, and the what if. We didn't just build temples to the gods, we built our entire mental architecture around them. When we look at the history of our species, we see a long line of detectives trying to figure out the rules of the world. First, we thought the rules were set by spirits in the trees. Then we thought they were set by a single, all-powerful creator. Now, we think they are set by the laws of physics. But in every era, we are doing the same thing. We are looking for the mind behind the mechanism. We are still looking for the agent in the grass. The evidence from the pit of bones in Spain is 400,000 years old, but the motive behind it hasn't changed. We are still looking for ways to make sense of the senseless. We are still looking for ways to bridge the gap between our physical bodies and our internal worlds. The red Hondax was a signal sent across a vast distance of time, a message from a mind that was just starting to realize it was alone in the universe and was desperately trying to find a way not to be. We will likely never know the name of the individual who dropped that stone into the darkness. We will never know what they said or what they hoped to gain. But we know what they felt. They felt the same glitch that we feel when the wind howls a little too loudly outside our window. They felt the same social pressure to contribute to something larger than themselves. And they felt the same biological need to believe that a beautiful, red stone could somehow matter to the dead. The case for why ancient humans started believing in gods is closed, but the verdict is unsettling. We didn't choose to believe. We were built to believe. It was the price we paid for our intelligence. It was the trade-off for our survival. And as we move forward into a future of artificial intelligence and genetic engineering, we have to wonder if we are still building new gods to fill the same old gaps in our wiring. Are we still just throwing red hand axes into the pit, hoping that something, somewhere, is finally going to reach out and catch them? This investigation into our spiritual origins reveals a truth that is both empowering and terrifying. We are a species defined by our hallucinations. Our greatest achievements, our laws, our nations, our moral codes, are all built on the foundation of things that don't exist in the physical world. We are the only animals that live in a reality of our own making. And while that reality has allowed us to conquer the planet, it also keeps us tethered to a past that we can never truly escape. If you look at the history of the world as a crime scene, the gods are the ultimate suspects. They've been at every major event, from the first burials to the first cities to the first wars. They've been blamed for our failures and credited with our successes. But the DNA evidence is clear. The gods are us. They are the projection of our fears, our hopes, and our evolutionary needs. They are the shadow that our species casts on the wall of the universe. And yet, even knowing that, we can't seem to turn the lights off. We still feel the weight of the divine eye. We still seek the comfort of the Heavenly Father. We are like a detective who has solved the case but refuses to sign the paperwork because he's still a little bit afraid of the dark. We have unmasked the gods, only to find our own faces staring back at us. This leaves us with one final question. If we are the ones who created the gods to help us survive, what happens to us now that we think we don't need them anymore? Can a society built on the social glue of the divine survive in a purely secular world? Or are we just waiting for the next evolutionary glitch to provide us with a new set of invisible agents to keep us in line? Only time will tell if we can maintain the civilization the gods built without the gods themselves to hold it up. But for now, the evidence remains. In the caves of Iraq, in the pits of Spain, and in the stone circles of Turkey, the fingerprints of the first believers are still visible. They are a testament to the power of the human imagination and the sheer, desperate brilliance of a species that refused to live in a world that didn't have a meaning. We have traveled a long way from that limestone pit in Spain, but in many ways, we haven't moved an inch. Which brings us back to that one specific physical detail. Imagine that Hondax one more time. It's sitting at the bottom of a dark, damp pit, surrounded by the bones of 28 people who have been dead for 400 millennia. It hasn't been used to hunt. It hasn't been used to butcher. It has no wear and tear. It is perfectly sharp, perfectly red, and perfectly useless. It was a sacrifice of the most valuable thing those people owned, given to a void that could never say thank you. We look at that stone and we see a primitive superstition. But we should see a warning. That Hondax is the ultimate proof of our costly signaling. It is a reminder that being human has always meant being willing to throw away the physical for the sake of the imaginary. It is a chilling, definitive closing argument for the nature of our species. We are the animals that sacrifice the real for the sake of the ghost. And as long as we carry that red quartzite in our minds, the gods will never truly be dead. If you found this investigation into the ancient origins of belief as fascinating as we did, there is so much more to uncover. We've only scratched the surface of the detective work being done in caves and temples around the world. We're curious to hear what you think about the big gods theory. Do you think civilization could have started without a supernatural police force? Let us know in the comments. We're building a community of people who love digging into these deep history rabbit holes, and we'd love for you to join us. If you want to see our next investigation into the bizarre ritual life of the Neanderthals, make sure to subscribe. We'll be back soon with more clues from the human story. But for now, just remember that the next time you hear a strange noise in the dark, your brain is already making a sacrifice to the leopard that isn't there. That's all for today. Thanks for watching.